In this lecture, we'll be discussing Aztec Civilization. So, when you think of the Aztecs, think about Mexico. Their civilization was basically contained within modern day Mexico, especially here in the center. And of course, their capital of Tenochtitlan is now connected to Mexico City. So, where did the Aztecs come from? Well, like a lot of people, we don't know where they came from in a sense. It's kind of funny. Like it was the case the Aryans were like, yeah, these people moved in here from somewhere. We're not quite sure. We'll see there's something kind of similar with the Inca. But basically, the Aztecs migrated into the Mexico Valley at some point. It's not clear when. And when they came, they found that there were already urban centers there. So this seems to be kind of like a nomadic group of people who are going to come into an area where there are already urban settlements, right? So there's already people who are living in towns who have developed, their own civilizations, and the Aztec come among them and worked as mercenaries. So the Aztecs will work for the various kind of city-states, you could almost say, though I think they're actually bigger than city-states, that are in this Mexico Valley, and they work for them as mercenaries. And in some ways, you can kind of think of the Aztecs as the Romans, I believe, because this is according to their own history. Remember how the Romans kind of recorded a history themselves that wasn't always maybe the nicest, you could say, right? You may recall that their city was founded by two brothers, one of whom murdered the other after he made fun of the size of the city walls, right? So the Aztecs record some interesting stories about themselves, and basically, according to their stories, they worked for these other urban centers as mercenaries, and then because they were so brutal and so interested in capturing people to sacrifice, their bosses are like, yeah, we don't want to necessarily hire you guys anymore. And it's kind of interesting, right? If you're too scary that people don't want to hire you to be mercenaries. If I'm going to hire mercenaries, I want them to be the biggest, toughest guys around. And you got to think, the Aztecs, in a sense, were so big, tough, and scary that other people are like, we're not so sure about this. So this is a tough warrior society we're talking about, right? That celebrates this kind of idea of courage and ability in combat. Fortunately for the Aztecs, though, the war god promised that he would find them a place to live, and he would mark it with a sign. And you're maybe familiar with this story because it's a really cool story. The sign was to be like a eagle would land on top of a cactus with a snake in its mouth. Now, it doesn't have a snake in this image, but that's the version I heard. And so the story goes that the Aztecs traveled around looking for this place marked by this sign from the war god, and they found it on an island in the middle of a swamp. So it was like the worst place in a sense. And this makes sense, right? Because they were in an area that was already largely settled. Of course, people take the best places first. But the thing is, the Aztecs are tough people, and so they're not going to allow a little bit of a swamp to bother them. They're going to turn the swampy area into the great floating city of Tenochtitlan. We'll talk about that shortly, but this would become basically kind of a marvel. When the Spanish showed up in the 16th century, they were amazed by this city. So the Aztecs, in a sense, come from humble beginnings. They're a warrior culture, and they're able to transform this swamp into a thriving metropolis of Tenochtitlan. And eventually, once they have their own kind of base, right, their own city, they can transition from being mercenaries who had trouble finding work because they were apparently too good at their job. They're going to move from being mercenaries and working for other people to conquering on their own, right? And through alliances and conquests, they're going to slowly expand their power in the Mexico Valley. And they're going to start establishing an empire, right? So they've gone from being kind of wandering nomads without their own land to soldiers for hire to having their own city. And now we're talking about them having their own empire. And Ahuitzotl, in particular, is going to be very important in terms of expanding this empire, building up this city of Tenochtitlan. And that's Ahuitzotl pictured right there. This is kind of his, it's a little bit complex, I believe, but it's this kind of spirit guardian animal that the Aztecs believed in. It's kind of like an aquatic mammal. And what's funny is people say it's kind of mythical, but according to Cortez, one of these mythical creatures killed one of his soldiers, Hernando Cortez, the conquistador that defeated the Aztecs. So in any case, that's what this critter is, kind of hanging around this guy. It's kind of like his guardian spirit. If you look very closely behind me in the camera, you might see my guardian spirit as well. But in any case, Ahitzotl is going to be building up this Aztec empire, like I said, centered on this city of Tenochtitlan, which by his time, because the Aztecs are doing such a great job kind of building up things, is going to have more than 250,000 people. This is much bigger than like London or Paris, or I think pretty much every city in Western Europe. So, like I said, when we're dealing with these Native American civilizations, they're really fascinating because on one side, the Aztecs pretty much stay at a Stone Age level of technology when it comes to like weapons. But when it comes to infrastructure, they're really good. And it's kind of funny. It's this warrior culture that has really good infrastructure and is really good at administering things. Because how else can you have a city of more than 250,000 people? That's very difficult. The Spaniards and Aztec sources agree that this was a very clean city. The Aztecs made great efforts to keep it nice and clean, which is very different from some of the medieval towns that we've looked at. And they had a lot of schools, right? So this is kind of, a place you want to be, right? Clean, lots of education. Sounds good to me. They also used a kind of concrete-like substance that is still around to help build their buildings. So again, these are people who, like I say, they're interested. They remind me a lot in many ways of the Romans, because they're people who have a good, or I should say have a strong warrior ethos, a strong warrior culture, who at the same time are really good at engineering. And one thing also, again, this connects them with the Romans, I think, is they spent a great deal of time building up their roads. And they did this in part so they could have messengers who could get very quickly to any part of their empire. In fact, they could deliver a message over the same amount of distance that it would take to a day in a shorter time. Right? So you could actually, if they had an important message, they could get it faster than our postal service could. Now, of course, we have text messages now. So if it's really important, you could just text someone. But again, that's pretty impressive because they didn't have gasoline-powered vehicles. When they had to deliver a message, they had a messenger who had to run, but they had a system of runners. They had good roads. They could get those messages out quickly. And communication is absolutely important if you want to form an empire. And of course, these roads were useful as well for bringing in tribute. So like I said, there's a lot of things that make these guys very similar to the Romans. You have a warrior culture building up an empire with pretty advanced infrastructure. And at the center of this warrior culture, in some ways similar to the Romans, but also different, were the gods. But in many ways, the Aztec Empire has a little bit more well-developed of a religion. You could say perhaps in the Romans, it's a little bit more theological, you could say. So Ahitzotl in Tenochtitlan is going to build this really amazing temple, right? Build this really amazing temple to the gods of rain and war, right? Those are the two central gods of the Aztecs, right? The god of war, who makes it so they can conquer, so they can fight. Like I said, this is a warrior culture, but also the god of rain, which is necessary for crops to grow. And it kind of makes sense, right? Rich country, strong army. Agricultural basis is the foundation. Food is the foundation of any civilization. And the Aztecs realized it, and so it's no accident that the two most important gods were the gods that had to do with food production, which leads to a surplus, which leads to cities and all that wonderful stuff, and then war, which lets you expand your empire and defend your cities. And again, to give you a sense of the splendor of Tenochtitlan and the kind of power of Ahitzotl, this is a model of the Temple Mayor, this temple I was talking about, with one of these dedicated to the god of war, one to the god of rain. And you can see this is a kind of step pyramid like what we've seen before, but it's not solid all the way through. You can see they have a very detailed temple complex within. Now, as I mentioned previously, the Aztecs are a warrior society, right? It's a society built around war. So it's kind of interesting. All free boys were trained for war. So if you weren't a slave, and they had slavery, they also had something like serfdom. If you were a free boy, you were trained how to fight. All right, you were trained how to fight. And your rank in society could be determined by how successful you were in combat, right? So if you're a really good warrior, you could actually go up in social ranks. There's some social mobility. In particular, if you captured 4 prisoners for sacrifice, you would become a noble, which was necessary to serve in the government. So it's interesting. Aztec warfare develops very differently from European-style warfare or any warfare that I know of for that instance, because it's focused not on killing the enemy or seizing territory. It's focused on taking prisoners. So their goal was not to stab someone, but to capture them, typically to knock them out, so they could be sacrificed later. If you got 4 of these, you could become a noble and serve in the government. If you fail, you weren't punished, you just were a commoner. You just had to do work other than being a warrior. I said, though, that there's unfree people, serfs and slaves. They stand outside the system. They don't count within it. One thing that's really striking to me is how the Aztecs, even though it's this kind of warrior society, and we usually think of warfare as something men do, at least in the ancient past, I should say, here women were seen as warriors and childbirth was seen as a battle. So this here reminds me a bit of the Spartans, right? The Spartans have this idea that to have strong warriors, you need strong mothers. And the Aztecs have a similar idea, and they see, childbirth as a kind of battle, which makes a lot of sense considering it's very painful, it's a test of endurance, and of course it has a relatively high death rate, right? Death in childbirth is fairly common in ancient societies, traditional societies. So it makes a lot of sense to have that connection. So religion was very important to how the Aztecs ruled. And we need to talk a little bit about how their system of government and their religion. So one thing that's a little bit complex here is this. When you hear the term emperor, you think of someone who's really powerful, really strong, right? But the Aztecs, and just as an aside, if you're really interested in history, this is similar to how the Holy Roman Empire worked. Their emperors were elected. Now, I don't mean that they would have like an election with campaigning and, vote for me, Avitzodol. No, vote for me, Montezuma. They didn't have something like that. Rather, there was a certain group of noble families who had the right to choose the emperor. So it was a small group of people that decided it basically amongst themselves. And this led to weak emperors because in order to get elected, you had to make a lot of promises, right? Just like any politician, if you want to be elected, you got to make promises and you're expected to keep those promises. So once you get elected, it's not like, okay, I'm the emperor, you have to do what I say. It's kind of like, okay, I'm the emperor. I'm emperor because you guys did favors for me. I got to do your favors, return your favors for you. And also the emperor is kind of checked in a sense because there's a very powerful priesthood. Religion is very important for the Aztecs for reasons we'll discuss. And of course, in a society where religion is very important, the people in charge of religion are also very important. And in Aztec religion, the priests were in charge of offering sacrifice. And of course, that was sacrifice to the gods. Why? The gods feed us, so we should feed them, right? The gods feed us, so we should feed them. And it's interesting because there's kind of this idea that, for example, the rain god, there was like a wet, dry season. The rain god feeds us for half the year by giving us the rain we need. So we need, in the dry season, to return something to the god, right? This would be like a human sacrifice to keep the god alive, to take care of the god. So then the god will be able to make it rain again when the wet season rolls around. So there's this idea that we human beings are dependent on the gods, but the gods are also dependent on us. They feed us. We need to feed them back. If we do not, the world ends. So, chances are you're not a big fan of human sacrifice. I'm not. But, in terms of theology, if you're going to have a reason to commit human sacrifice, I guess this works. It's like, well, if we don't do this, the whole world's going to end. Though, again, I'm not condoning human sacrifice, mind you. I'm just saying that the Aztecs had a logically coherent reason behind why they did it. Now, the sacrifices were, of course, often war captives. Not always, right? Not always, but oftentimes they were people who were captured in war. And you recall they fought wars based around that. In fact, you had your rank as in society could be raised based on your ability to capture prisoners, right? We just talked about that. If you could capture 4, you could become a noble. And the Aztecs even had what they called flower wars, where they would fight a war with someone else just to get people to sacrifice. The goal of the war was not to get money or to, seize a trading area or something like that. It was just to get prisoners to sacrifice. Now, this had a religious role, but it also had a political reason behind it. Basically, these sacrifices were typically public events, right? These were typically public events. Like if we go back really quickly to the Temple Mayor, the sacrifice would occur up here, and a lot of times the victim's body would be thrown down the stairs. So this was happening out in the open. It was very public. And people were invited to watch it. Not only Aztecs, but other people as well. Other nations were invited into this to watch it and to kind of, experience it and see what this was all about. And the idea of this was to emphasize that we Aztecs are scary. It's much better to be our friend, because if you're our enemy, you may be sacrificed next. Right? You are a neighbor to the Aztecs. You're weaker than the Aztecs, and you're invited to go to this. You're going to go. You're not going to refuse, of course. You attend, and you see people being sacrificed. And you certainly don't want to be sacrificed. You don't want your loved ones to be sacrificed. Better do what the Aztecs want you to do, and what the Aztecs want you to do is give them tribute. Right? To give them money, to give them resources, whatever they want, you're going to give it to them. So this is kind of how the Aztec Empire works. It's a tribute-based empire. They're not going out necessarily and conquering huge swaths of territory that they then administer directly. Right? This makes them a bit different from the Romans, and this is, I think, key to one thing that makes the Aztec Empire a little bit fragile. They're not so interested in direct control. They want to subjugate the people around them, and then they want those people to basically give them the resources that they want, to give them money, people, whatever it is they want, and that's it. They're not going to administer too much directly. So that means they're not particularly well integrated. If you're an Aztec, this is great. You love it. This is a great system. If you're not an Aztec, you basically just accept the system because you don't have a choice. This is a bit different from the Romans, right? The Romans, over a long period of time, could assimilate people into their empire, make them feel like they were a part of the empire too. That generally didn't happen with the Aztec Empire, right? People who were not Aztecs, who were part of the empire, pretty much felt like they weren't Aztecs and they were getting beaten up on. And wouldn't it be nice to be free of the Aztecs, but there's no one here scarier than them, so we just have to put up with them. And then the Spanish show up, and the Spanish are pretty scary. But that's something we'll have to talk about later. For now, this is in many ways an impressive empire built around a warrior culture that was skilled at engineering and infrastructure, but it does have a flaw in that it tends to emphasize rule by fear. And that works as long as you're the scariest guy around. When someone scarier shows up, it can be an issue.